of our chapel at a school called Christchurch in Perth, which overlooked the Swan River. And we never used to pay much attention. There was like the piece in the middle where all the people were talking and whatever, and there was just two really big windows on each side, and we just watched the boats go past. But I particularly remember one time someone came in and talked to us, and I'm not sure what the whole topic was about, but he ended up talking about public speaking. And as a 14 or 15-year-old kid I was at the time, I was petrified of standing in front of groups of people and talking. And I remember he talked about different things that people did. And there was one time that he was at a presentation, and the person who was giving the presentation was standing with their hands like this, and they kept going like this all the time. And because of a whole lot of 14-year-old boys, we thought, yeah, that was pretty funny, pretty hilarious. But then the other thing that he said was that he was at a presentation one time, and the person was standing up the front, and their fly was undone. And this bloke gave the presentation the whole time, with his fly completely undone, was completely unaware of it, and it didn't really matter in the scheme of things, but it probably distracted the people in the audience a fair bit. So every time I give a presentation now, before I get up there, I quickly check my fly, just to make sure. So if you see me just checking on the way through, just making sure that everything's kosher.
Spilling the booze.
Yeah. So because a lot of people don't like public speaking, so I thought that might break the ice a little bit. Okay, we're going to finish off on the WA experience from yesterday, so just quickly cover off on a few more slides on potassium and sulphur. I think that's about it in there. So as I did kind of mention it to a degree, we're pretty simplistic in the way that we approach our critical levels for potassium for our high rainfall pastures. So we're using the coal well extraction. You'll use coal well, or you may see milli equivalents in terms of the cation numbers. But pretty much if we're sort of 50 and below, we're saying that's deficient. If we're in that mid-range, typically we won't see much of a response. And then if we're sort of 100 and above, we're usually pretty good. That is a little bit different than what comes out of the National Better Fertiliser Decisions Project. And the critical numbers change around the soil type. And I guess that's to do with availability within those different soil types. So there's a few different numbers there. To show you how the responses panned out in WA and why we use those numbers. So this chart is a little bit busy, but I'll explain it as best I can. So essentially we've got a soil test value across the bottom here in our coal well numbers, and then a whole range of experiments. So every one of those dots is a different set of trial data. And basically where we had coal well K values of sort of 50 and below, where potassium was applied, we were getting anywhere from maybe 1.5 to 5 tonnes of dry matter response. So highly responsive in those scenarios, and telling us that we're typically going to get a good response and get a good bang for our buck out of putting potassium on in that situation. Where the numbers were sort of more between 50 and 100, it was a lot more variable. We got quite a few relatively low responses, but we also got quite a few high responses. I don't understand, or I haven't interrogated that data enough to know why some sites were responsive and some sites weren't. But then once we got above that 100 critical value, and all those values are sitting on the line there, basically we got no response. So we had more than enough potassium in the system in that situation. So that's why we use the numbers that we use. Again, you need to ground truth them in your own backyard, but it gives you some good confidence with a big set of data like that, that we can work with those numbers, if you like. So that then bears through to the next one there, the strategies. So basically what we were doing, less than 50, we're putting some potassium on in the autumn, and then typically we're going back in the spring as well. And this is just on general pasture, not necessarily a lot of the pasture in our area is also used for pasture hay or meadow hay. Typically ryegrass, improved ryegrass is sown for that situation. So we're also putting potassium just into general pasture paddocks. At that 50 to 100, where the response was going to be fairly variable, some responded, some didn't. Typically we wouldn't put anything on in the autumn. We'll plant test it during the winter, If we come up with a less than sufficient result in the plant test, then we know that we're going to get a response, and so we'll put some on. And then typically with anything that's 100 milligrams per kilo or more, we won't bother with anything much in the autumn. We'll still plant test it just to make sure, and then typically only paddocks that are going to be cut for hail silage would get potassium put on them just to try and replace some of what is removed. We don't go anywhere near replacing all that's removed in that situation. So that's our numbers around and our strategy around potassium. Questions?
Was there a soil type association with those responsive soils or not?
I haven't been through the data enough. I'm sure that there would be some to a degree. Yeah. Typically, most of the sites, there's 3 particular farms where a lot of that trial work was done through the Greener Pastures project. 2 of those farms are very sandy soil types. One of them's a bit better soil type, but still not as good as your good soils. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, just you know, again, take it into context as to where the work was done and the background situation of the sites. But it gives you something to work with. Ros?
When you say to put out 10 to 20 kilos of potassium, that's potassium, not potash?
Yeah, so for muriated potash, double that number because it's 49.5%. Yep. So yeah, that's just elemental nutrient value. Yep. All right. I kind of get the feeling, talking to a few people, that maybe not a lot of potassium is applied on pastures, maybe on the island.
A lot of the soil test results come back pretty high.
Yep.
That's fair, isn't it? A lot of our soil test results come back high. Yeah.
And backed up by plant tests as well.
Yeah, it's just on patches that are like deep sand that are pretty good as well.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yep. So the important thing again is just to know where you're at, measure it, have a good understanding of where the base level is, what's likely to be responsive in that scenario.
Yeah. And I just want to make a comment about potassium levels too. High potassium levels in pastures in the early part of winter can actually predispose towards hypomagnesemia as well, grass tetany. Okay, so it is a major issue for us, particularly in the Cygnet River area and down through the Haynes and McGillivray area on the island. So if we have a long, hot, dry summer, that tends to mineralise potassium and make it more available to pastures in the early growth phase. And so you often end up with high potassium levels in that pasture, which induces an acute magnesium deficiency in cattle, and you'll get acute deaths. I've experienced it myself. It's very, very hard to control, and we're really going to be controlled through magnesium supplementation to the cows. So it is high potassium is also not something you want to be looking at.
Yep. Yeah, definitely one to be careful of. We've noticed, or growers have noticed that potentially Angus seem to be a bit more, in terms of the cattle at home, seem to be a bit more sensitive to that. But yeah, late cold starts, typically be the worst scenario for that to happen. Yep. So yeah, do be careful of that one. All right, that's the potassium story in a nutshell. Sulphur. So sulphur's an interesting one. Again, some pretty well-defined numbers around where that needs to be. The numbers actually tend to shift a little bit depending on which bit of research you read and where it's from. More recently, we've been using sort of down to 5 or 6 being sufficient. I think I'd be probably more comfortable around 8 to 10, which more so lines up with these better fertiliser decision project numbers. What we found, and we talked about the whole scenario yesterday with phosphorus and phosphorus potentially being well above the critical value, so people back off or reduce phosphorus applications, but sulphur may still be limiting. Typically when you've been putting super out, you're putting out more sulphur than you are phosphorus. Don't put any super on, you're not putting any sulphur on, and you're running into sulphur deficiency. So think about how that's going to be managed. It's not too hard to get around. It could be done possibly with gypsum if you've got local sources, a bit of ammonium sulphate in the fertiliser. Those sorts of things can overcome that pretty easily. So that's not too tricky. Again, rates for our situations. If it's deficient, it needs more essentially. And there's a bit of variation around soil type with that. The heavier soils, higher buffering capacity will retain sulphur a bit more. Even though sulphur will move through the profile where drainage can occur. So just consider that in context of your soil type to a degree. What we'll often see, and it sounds like some of your soils are under the same situations where relatively sandy on top, they get pretty wet through the winter, and then you come into spring, a lot of that water drains away. We have that same kind of scenario. That's when we see our major sulphur deficiencies occurring at the end of winter after that drainage occurs. So possibly applications later in the season are going to be more beneficial than earlier ones, if you've identified that sulphur is a problem in the system, because often there's enough sulphur mineralised from organic matter from crop residue early in the season. You get those leaching events and the drainage occurring through winter, and then that's when it kicks in at the end of winter. So if you can get back on the paddocks at that stage, probably a good way to go about it. All right, that's sulphur. There's a slide there on plant testing. Should we cover that? Sure. Yep. Okay. So I've talked a fair bit about this in the presentation, and particularly around soil and plant testing. Hands up who's done plant testing regularly? Regularly is the important thing there. 5 years ago doesn't count. Yeah, yep. So as I say there, look, it's underutilised. I don't see it as being a difficult task. Typically what we're doing when we're taking samples in pasture is we're just grabbing what the animals are going to eat. So it could be a mixture of clover and ryegrass, avoiding weeds where we can, but taking the pasture species that is predominant in that situation, because that's reflective of of the majority of what you're trying to produce generally. So it's not a difficult process to do that.
Can I just start, before you go on, can I just ask why it's not being used regularly?
Confusion around critical values for clover versus grasses and youngest emerged blade. Challenge I have.
Yeah.
Even having red water rules, it's pretty still a bit.
Yeah.
Are you still getting encouraged to take youngest open blade, youngest open leaf, or are you getting encouraged to take the whole thing?
I don't know. I'm confused.
Yeah.
I've done it professionally, so.
So okay, well.
Yeah.
There you
Yeah,
go.
look, I mean, the standards have obviously been developed for lots of those things, and yeah, you look at those tables in Reuter and Robertson, and they do have some different values at different crop stages. You're not going to do anything on farm if it's not, I guess, simple and practical to do, and to get out there and to take a whole lot of stuff and to get back the shed and to try and sort it all out. I don't know anyone that's ever done that.
I have. It's painful.
In a commercial context,
No.
yeah. So research projects and that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I've seen people sorting out dry grass from dead grass and all sorts of stuff. And you guys don't have the time to do that. I don't. And while what I'm advocating in terms of just grabbing what the animals are eating, we're still sampling, by using gloves and that sort of stuff, so we're not getting any contamination. We're avoiding, all the high nutrient areas, so the urine and dung patches, and doing all those things right. But there is values there that I've used for quite a while for, just whole tops, for crop or for pasture. So yeah, I don't see why it needs to be too difficult. And some of that may be just a pushback from maybe the fertiliser suppliers and where you've been getting plant testing and stuff done. I'm not sure over here, but yeah, I don't see why it needs to be difficult. And I reckon personally it's a whole lot simpler than doing soil testing. Yeah.
Sam, our agronomist is a FERT Care accredited dude.
Yep. We're not bad people.
Right, so you're one of
Yeah.
them too.
Yeah.
So and he's actually suggested to it, back in the summer he took some samples, GPS plotted some soil samples, and he's intending to go back, actually we probably almost missed the boat I suppose, but going back to those same sites and taking plant tissue samples. So you guys, would he is there a standard practice, best practice for that sort of sampling that he would be
Yeah, it's a fair while since I did my FERT care training, so and a lot of that's more around environmental principles than it is actual practice in the field. Yeah, look, there's recommendations around how to go about taking samples for sure. Yeah, I guess I've probably fallen into complacency to a degree in collecting those samples, having been doing it for so long. So yeah, I probably should sharpen up on that.
I just wondered if there was a...
But typical as like we put up with the soil testing yesterday, you know, zigzag pattern across the paddock. The way I often do it, particularly in pasture, is you just sort of take 20 steps, you know, once you get the 20 steps, just whatever's at the end of your boot, just grab it, you know, provided it's the desirable species, or just, you know, move within that little area just to get what you need. But, you know, try to be unbiased about what you collect, yeah, because otherwise you won't get a representative picture. Yep.
The soil testing and plant tissue testing, what do you actually recommend doing like in a year? Do you recommend doing soil testing once a year and plant testing
Okay.
once a year, or like once every 5? Or?
Yeah, no, soil testing, I would say lighter soil types maybe every 3 years, heavier soil types every 4, because they don't change that much. You know, the key indicators off a soil test like pH, phosphorus levels, potassium, they're not going to, you know, be 100% different year to year. Yep. They're going to be similar, and what you're trying to look at there is a trend over time. Yep. Plant testing I do more often, you know, even to the point of, you know, doing some plant testing every year, because that'll give you a lot better indication. And as it says right there, a whole lot better indicator of availability under seasonal conditions. Yep.
So if the pasture's really stemmy, you just take the whole thing, do you? Like if you've got a high, like a tall clover dominant pasture,
yep.
So you've got a lot of stem in there. If you're pulling it out at the ground level, you're going to get a lot of stem. That's okay? Yeah.
That's all I've been doing. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yep. So it's a whole crop level. Yep. Yeah. That's what the animals are going to be eating. So yeah. So it's as much some of that, you know, and you look at so particularly nitrogen values coming out of the pasture gives you a relative indicator of crude protein as well. So yeah, we're looking at it, you know, obviously from that point of view. Doug, let's be controversial here, please.
Can I just throw a thought in there? Did you hear it?
There's a thought.
In terms of what part of the pasture to sample, if I'm on a farm and the farmer says, I think I've got an animal health problem, trace elements maybe, then I take samples like you were saying, mimicking what the animal's eating. Never mind, it'll be on the high dung patches, high fertility patches, just pretending you're a cow chomping away, because you want to measure how much a nutrient is going down the animal's throat. But if the farmer says to me, I've got a problem with my clover, then it's very, very important to take a clover-only sample. There's a huge difference in nutrient levels between clover and grasses.
True.
And you cannot use a mixed sample as a measure of the nutrition in the soil. That's my thought.
I'll agree with that for sure.
You will agree?
Yes.
You're a gentleman, sir.
Yeah. He doesn't want me to agree. He wants us to. He wants to fight. I guess in the discussion, and a lot of the time because I'm collecting those samples myself, I'm assessing and doing what Doug does. You know, you're visually eyeballing the paddock and you're seeing what's there and you know what's being collected. So in the interpretation of the numbers, you know, where I've collected the samples, I've got a good idea whether to weight my comments in relation to the clover standards or the ryegrass standards. Yep. So, and they are different. I mean, yeah, some of them are somewhat similar, but other elements are, you know, there are a fair bit of difference in them. So, yep.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just with the, what are the preferred times to actually take these samples? So, like, because the actual benchmarks would change during the year, wouldn't it? Like,
Yep.
midwinter and spring and full-blown spring. Like, I mean, they'd be all different.
Yeah. So typically, what we're advocating is any time, and again, take this into context of our dairy grazing systems in WA. We're doing it any time, sort of after the first grazing event. So typically, it's not going to be until pasture is going to be grazed on the second rotation. So they've got through that early part of the year. They're well established. We're not seeing at that point then too much. You know, typical high nitrogen levels coming off mineralisation from the first rains. So that sort of started to settle down and, you know, you're into a bit more of a pattern. And then basically right through winter, avoiding, stress conditions, whether it be if it does end up getting really dry or it gets too wet, waterlogging, avoiding that kind of scenario. So you want the pasture to be actively growing. And then typically, once we get to probably the end of August for us, we wouldn't be doing a lot after that point, because then we're starting to get into sort of warming conditions and we're getting that big elevation. We've had, complete canopy closure. The pastures are starting to move up, so they become, more reproductive to a degree. So yeah, probably after that point, you're starting to lose the opportunity to correct any deficiency that might be identified as well, as the season's running out. Righto. So yeah, better indicator of availability, particularly for trace elements. So, I guess when you look at trace elements and the additional cost that comes with those, mixing them into other fertilisers, or if you really want to focus on one element than another, the soil tests become a little bit more rubbery around trace element values. So plant testing is a lot more accurate. It's a definitive amount. It's either there or it's not. It's not subject to the availability, whether the pH is different, whether there's too much calcium or not enough magnesium, or all these other things that people might try and confuse you with. It is what it is with the values that you get back. And the critical values are well defined. So Broder and Robinson kind of been like the Bible, but there is plenty of other publications that have got critical values for clover and ryegrass particularly. So that's pretty good. And use it to map the trend over time. It's not really that expensive to do. It's relatively cheap as far as time goes. Get some results from similar areas, similar times of the season under similar growing conditions. See what's happening year on year, and you can put that data together, and then you can see, okay, well we're tracking pretty good, or we're actually increasing, or we're decreasing. If you see that you're decreasing, you're getting closer and closer to the critical value each year, think, righto, I'm going to have to start thinking about doing something about that. And you're forewarned, you haven't actually fallen off the bus or under the bus and had a problem. So yeah, that's where we're at with plant testing. I think we've talked about the how already. So yeah, identifying paddocks off soil tests. Like I said, grab samples for what I'm doing. If you are experiencing a problem with one crop type versus the other, just sample that. Sample that part of the crop. Quite often ryegrass might be okay, but clover's not, and that could be something like potassium causing that. Like I said, similar pattern across the paddock, zigzag, avoiding going in sort of straight lines where maybe a spreader just went straight down that, could have been 2 or 3 years ago that it happened. You won't know that now.
Diagonally straight across the paddock, is that as good as zigzag? Because you never go diagonally across the paddock to spread out lime fertiliser.
As long as you don't go diagonally across the headlands. Yeah. I'd tend to find, maybe if there's one side of the paddock that might be kind of longer than the others, I might zigzag down that side. But quite often when I do it, I'll drive into the paddock, I'll drive right to the other end so you can see, the whole paddock to start with, and you think, right, okay, that's where I'm going to take the sample, as I work back across.
Yep. Yeah.
Rather than just sort of getting in the gate and taking the sample and then, oh, there's enough, and oh, hang on, there's another 30 acres around the back of that bit of bush that I didn't do. Yeah. And sample integrity, again, so typically when we're plant testing, and probably particularly relevant for you guys, I don't know how good the service in relation to postal and couriers and that sort of stuff is. Typically always taking them early in the week, Monday, Tuesday, so you can get them in the mail and get them to the lab so they can start getting them dried down, before the weekend. Don't take them on a Saturday and leave them in the back of the ute and then put them in the post box on Sunday night on the way home from footy. Probably not the best idea. When you are sampling, use some milking gloves, or there is gloves that come with some of the kits, but often there's not enough. So grab one of those boxes of milking gloves, 100 gloves. They're only a few dollars. And use those so that you're not contaminating the sample, because if you've opened the gate and it's got a zinc coated latch on the gate, there could be enough zinc come off onto your hands, and then you grab the sample and then you think, oh no, zinc's bloody, there's heaps of that there, but I haven't put any on for a few years. That's pretty good. Won't spend any money on that, and you could have a deficiency. So things like that can come into play. And then there's a couple of methods of actually getting the data back to you and how quickly the labs will push those samples through. So dry ash versus sap testing. Look, they're both relevant. What's important is that you do the same one consistently so that when you're trying to compare results year on year, you've got the same kind of data. Sap results will turn around a lot quicker than what dry ash samples will. Again, like I say, just be consistent with what you do. I guess the traditional way has been dry ash, which is typically sort of 5 working days through a lab. Don't know about APAL, what they do here in SA. Haven't used them for plant testing. So yeah, we've either used